experienced maybe a what you would describe as a near-death experience, like something that happened where you felt like you were close to dying, a time when you felt like that it was imminent, but then maybe something happened and you did not. Um, and what was that like? First time, first time on a roller coaster. You thought you were going to die? Is that what it was? Okay, so you thought that that bar was not enough to hold you down, right? And if you went flying, then who knows what might happen? Yeah. So after that first time on the roller coaster, did you get back on one? No. Okay. I know some people like that. I don't know that we're ever going to convince Asher to get back on a roller coaster. We'll see. Yes, sir. First time flying solo. Mm-hmm. Uh, did something specific happen, or was it just the experience itself where? Right, right. Uh, little fear there. Right. Okay. Okay. So enough pain from a kidney stone to convince you that maybe this is it. Maybe this is the time. Maybe maybe this should be the time because I don't want to be in this pain anymore. Yes, sir. You fell off a tractor and it ran over you, and you probably thought, well, this is it. You were about 15 years old, boy, and you thought your life it was pretty short, didn't you? Uh, so I had a couple experiences that I remember when I was pretty young involving swimming pools. And the one that comes to mind for me related to this lesson is a time when I had just barely started learning how to swim, and I was at somebody's house. I don't remember where we were, and it was a pool party, and so we were all having fun. And one of my friends thought he would help me out by pushing me into the deep end where I had never been before. And so all of a sudden, I'm just in the water and it's way over my head. I don't know what's going on. But the thing about that experience was my body reacted immediately. My body instinctually knew certain things to try and do to get my head up above the water so that I could breathe and everything. And so obviously I survived. I didn't really actually come all that close to death, or even though my, I don't know, 7-year-old mind may have thought I did. I don't know. But we have within us a survival instinct to keep us alive. Our bodies try to keep us alive in those circumstances when we are potentially facing death, and it's sometimes it's without us even thinking about it, whether we are fully conscious of it or not. And so, what you could say is that whether we are fully conscious and aware of it or not, there is an element of a fear of death in all of us. The realization that we, like all living things, are destined to die and can happen for reasons that can't be explained, for reasons that can't be anticipated or controlled, is not always the most exciting thing for us to spend time thinking about. And that's a contributor, I think, to why as we've been going through this class, maybe it's not the most comfortable class for us. But I want us to acknowledge that we even see in Jesus this kind of emotion as his death was approaching. If you remember, in the book of Matthew, as he is there in Gethsemane and he is praying, he says, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me." Now, yes, I would say that we would understand there is more than just death that Jesus is facing. But I think we have to acknowledge that there is some trepidation here. Jesus' humanity, his physical, human side, I think, is shining through here. But I want us to read an important passage in Hebrews chapter 2 this morning, because I think Hebrews chapter 2 tells us some really important things about what Jesus really accomplished for us. If somebody who could read good and strong and loud will read Hebrews 2, verses 10 through 15. Okay, I want you to notice something about what the Hebrews writer says here. Does Jesus' death mean that we are automatically never going to fear death? Take a look at verse 15. Okay, I see one person saying no. I fear the process of dying, you mean? Okay, so maybe death. Okay, so the process of dying is something to be feared, perhaps more than death itself. Okay. What do you think? What does the Hebrews writer say is for sure going to be relieved in verse 15? Okay, the enslavement to the fear of death. Now, what is the difference between having a fear of death and being enslaved by the fear of death? Okay, so it has everything to do with whether or not you're going to allow that fear to control you, because it can control your decision making. It can control the way that you live your life day in and day out. That fear of death it has the ability to control us. Have you ever heard someone say that courage is not the lack of fear? Have you heard this before? Courage is not a lack of fear. Or someone else you may recognize said it this way: courage is being scared to death but saddling up anyway. John Wayne. All right, that's the difference between the absence of fear and not being enslaved to fear. I would suggest that the fear of death, to some degree or another, is likely going to be a natural part of all of our lives. It is a part of, it's what fuels that survival instinct. But the Hebrews writer tells us that because of Jesus, we don't have to live our lives controlled by that fear. John, you want to say something? Okay. Okay, okay. I think John hits on something that we all saw around us is the difference between acknowledging the dangers of a disease that we've had to deal with the last couple of years and allowing that fear to control us. You know, the enslavement to fear is dangerous because of how it can affect so much of our lives. And it's everything from our daily decision making to even the way that we worship. It's our ability to serve. It affects our ability to share our faith with others. That fear can be a driving force in our lives. In fact, some philosophers, some psychologists, and others have suggested that the fear of death is actually at the root of much of the psychological issues that exist in society today. Um, I don't know how much psychology you have ever taken. I took just enough in college to be dangerous. But one of the things that was, or one of the individuals that were highly respected was Sigmund Freud. And that's probably a name that you have heard, whether you have taken a psychology class or not. He is just that well known of an influencer on the psychological world. Freud wanted to tie most people's psychological issues to sexual desires. And then this was during the time that when he lived around the turn of the 20th century. And then along came the 60s and the sexual revolution, and more people were buying into this idea because this then frees them to fulfill any and every desire that they have. But there were others, even contemporaries with Freud, like Gregory Zilborg, who's the guy pictured here on the right, who suggested that rather than the base issue being sexual desires, he says perhaps it is actually our struggle with death that is the culprit behind psychosis and the issues that we deal with in society. And as I was reading about this, I thought this was really interesting because this is new information to me. I had not heard this before. Because Zilborg actually says that Freud wasn't willing to suggest this. He wasn't willing to consider this as a possibility because Freud rejected any semblance of religion. He was not willing to accept the possibility of a higher intellectual being or anything of that nature. And so he was not willing to depend on God himself under any circumstance. And so he was looking for something else to point to as the root of humanity's issues, so to speak. So Zilborg and a lot of others have suggested and done study to try and see if perhaps this is true. Is this fear of death, or whether it's a conscious or subconscious fear of death, something that is at our root? I really like Soren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, who said that in the face of death's inevitability, mortals have no path to authentic human living besides faith. And then there was a book written in 1972 that was a groundbreaking book in the psychological world. It was called The Denial of Death. It's a book written by Ernest Baker. You can pick up a paperback copy for about $10 on Amazon. And he actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 1974 because of this book, although technically he wasn't around to see it, because right after he turned in the final draft to publishers, shortly after that, he was diagnosed with, I believe, cancer, and within a few months, he passed away. So the Pulitzer Prize was given posthumously. But in this book, Becker argues that our day-to-day activities, one of the problems with the way that we go about doing our lives, the way that we live our lives, is that we refuse to consistently acknowledge our mortality. He establishes that ignoring our finite, limited existence is at the root of our challenges as humans. And in this book, he also issues a challenge for us to start living differently. Since this book was written, more than 160 studies in 11 different countries have been performed to try and verify or perhaps debunk what Becker claimed. And two things have been consistently discovered that I want to draw your attention to, and I couldn't think of a way of making this any shorter than what is going to be on the screen, so I apologize. It may not be the easiest to read, and if you want to, write it down or come to me later, I can, send you a copy of this or whatever. So here's the two things that have been discovered in these 160 different studies, thousands upon thousands of people talking about death and our ability to deal with the reality of our mortality. Okay? On the one hand, when young and middle-aged people are put in a position to reflect on their own death, the tendency is for them to turn inward and go into a kind of survival mode and become aggressive toward those who hold different worldviews. They are more likely to cherish things like their country's flag. They're more likely to feel threatened by foreigners. They deepen their identification with what this author calls in-groups, whether that is their own gender, their own ethnic group, their own school affiliation, etc., etc., etc. So when those who typically don't have to live their daily lives thinking about death or thinking about their own mortality are confronted with their own mortality, the tendency is to withdraw from that possibility and lean more heavily on these in-groups of people and trust more in their inclusion in these groups than anything else. All right? On the other hand, the other discovery from all of these tests that were done, persons diagnosed with terminal illness, persons who recover after nearly dying, and the elderly, who this author points out are confronted with their death on a more regular basis anyway, they do not have the same reaction. They do not turn inward. They do not become defensive. On the contrary, their sustained habit of reflecting on death opens them up to others, even those from other in groups, and they are less concerned with materialism, fame, and money. Now, isn't that interesting? That those who are more frequently dealing with their own mortality are those who are more likely to be open to relationships beyond their normal relationships, less concerned with material, earthly things. I think what we're saying here is that when we make a habit of acknowledging our mortality, when this is a part of our regular life, it actually frees us from that slavery to the fear of death. It frees us from chasing after the things in this world that have no eternal consequence or eternal value. So let me ask you this question. What would you do if you knew today was your last day to live? What would you focus on? What would you consume your time and energy with? Okay, you'd spend more time in prayer with God. Okay, and you would reflect on what it would mean, what it's going to mean for those that you're leaving behind, your loved ones. What else would you fill your time with if you knew that today was for sure your last day to live? Okay, you'd spend more time with family. What else? Okay, there may be some regrets. It's a little short list, isn't it? You know, if we literally just have the one day and that's it, and we know it, our focus becomes much smaller. Our focus changes drastically from the typical way that we live our daily lives. I want us to consider a couple passages here, and the first is in Psalm 90, verses 3 through 6. Yes, sir. They, that's right. That's right. So maybe you would enjoy some things that if you know it's your last day, take advantage of enjoying some things that you haven't enjoyed every other day of your life necessarily, right? I think that's kind of what that tells us. Right. Then and again, the spiritual focus is something that is going to be on anybody's mind in that moment. All right, so somebody read verses 3 through 6 of Psalm 90 for us. Okay, now before we comment on that, let's jump over to James chapter 4 and read what James has to say in verses 13 and 14 of James chapter 4. And whenever you get there, somebody will go ahead and read that. Okay, so what do you think that both the psalmist and James are trying to get across to us? We are not here long. Life is fleeting. Life is short. The is compared to the thousands upon thousands of years of human history, the stark reality is that our lives are rather small, aren't they? And while for some that could be off-putting, when we embrace our limits, when we embrace our mortality, embrace how little control over it we have, it allows us to live small. And by that, well, let me ask you, what do you think it means to live small? Doesn't have anything to do with height or weight, okay? To withdraw, okay, okay. Stay within yourself, okay? To concentrate on the things that are really important, and then something was said behind the curtain. Okay, okay. So live small in terms of um, what you are required to have. This, well, just what do you think we mean by that as the class as the direction of the class is going? I think this is another way of saying learn to appreciate the smaller things in life, the things that are really important. Finding beauty, finding joy in day to day living. After all, one of the songs that we sing on occasion, Come Let Us Worship and Bow Down. All right, it's a song taken directly from Psalm 95. And at the end of that song and psalm, the words are, We are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. So if we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand, what does it mean we are not? What? The star, the shepherd, the hero, right? We're not the one out there heroically saving the flock from danger. We are just another sheep in the fold. And sometimes we get preoccupied with our own actions and our own accomplishments and our own worries, our own desires. And as a result of that, we make ourselves the center of our own worlds. Even though Scripture clearly teaches we are not. So living small then means acknowledging that we are not the center of the universe. God is. So we can then allow him to be the star that is in control, controlling all the big things. Let God deal with the big stuff. And then we can move forward focused on our small lives and the good things that we can do in our time, in our lives. Now, then the question becomes, what happens when we don't do that? When we don't live small? I think it's important that we also consider the other side of this coin. Instead of accepting our smallness, instead of acknowledging how short our time on this earth is, a lot of times the tendency is for people to put some type of hero on a pedestal and commit themselves to the ideals of this hero. All right, and this is another psychological issue that psychologists believe is an attempt to taste immortality. Okay, so here's an example, and granted, this is a bit extreme. Okay, this is not necessarily how everybody goes about it, but consider, how do authoritarian dictators like the Hitlers and the Stalins and the others, how do they come to power? Now, there's a number of factors, right? I mean, they promise a lot. Yes. All right? The masses accept their leadership regardless of how vile or inhumane it becomes, because of the promises that they're given. And at the root of those promises, very often, is something that there's a common denominator. And it's this desire to have something beyond yourself and beyond your time. That your nation is going to endure for generation upon generation, or your race is going to endure for generation upon generation. Military might is going to endure, etc., etc., etc. In essence, it's this promise of legacy that is being given. It's this promise of, which is a type of immortality, in essence. The appeal that it is going to continue beyond your lifetime. And so you can buy into that because it's going to last forever and ever and ever. And this is kind of a way of denying our own mortality and the smallness of our own individual lives. This is how idols that are nation rooted become a problem for Christians. The right and left side of the political aisle in the country that we live in right now is trying to get us to fixate on their virtues or their causes, and trying to get us to dehumanize anybody who disagrees with our side. But when we deny, or when we deny how small we are, we give way to slavery in the form of a dictator, national ideology, or sometimes both. So as Christians, living small means letting go of these idealized heroes, whether they are political, national, financial, occupational, etc., etc. Because we have to allow God to be the true hero in our lives and the only deliverer in our lives, and live our lives as such. Focusing on those things that you would focus on if today was your last day, rather than allowing ourselves to get caught up in so much that is not of eternal consequence. And that's the challenge for us today, as we continue to think about how to live our lives with our own mortality in view. We have to live smaller. We have to narrow our focus to the more important things. Now, other thoughts or comments or things, I know I've done a lot of talking today and haven't allowed you to do a lot. What other thoughts and comments do you have on this idea of living small? Right, right. Yeah. Okay. So if you couldn't hear what Sarah was saying, the idea of living small is kind of counter to the rat race. That constant striving for more, for something that's better, something that's bigger, something more, whether it's career wise or financially or something along those lines. Yeah. And that's an easy trap to fall into. Yes, sir.
Trying to achieve some kind of immortality through our heroes, whereas Christians, our one true hero should be the one who can truly provide us with immortality.
Well, right, and that's the point is that of course Jesus, our Lord, is the only one who is going to provide us anything beyond this short lifespan that we have. And that's why we have to trust in him rather than any promises being made to us in this world. Yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, the Hebrews writer is the one who says that it is appointed once for all of us to die, and then comes the judgment. And the challenge that I hope that you have understood from today's lesson is that a part of that is that we sometimes try to ignore that first half. We don't want to think about the fact that we are going to die, that our life is short, and so we try to do things with our lives or try to live beyond ourselves in such a way that we focus on the wrong things and perhaps focusing on today and what I can do for God today, how I can live my life today as if it were my last day. Perhaps that can help us to live small and within ourselves and allow God to handle the big stuff. Yes. Yes, yes. And we often use that phrase, take it one day at a time, live for today, those kinds of things. And that is a portion of what we're saying this morning is acknowledging how limited our time is and making sure that we are focused on the most important things. The challenge is for us to not go the other way with that, which is like almost more of a uh, go for the gusto, seize the day kind of approach to acknowledging that today might be the last day. Because that's not really what we're trying to encourage everybody to do. Because that is a very selfish focus when we uh, go to try to accomplish, or have what we might not ever get a chance to have if we go for it, if we don't go for it today, that kind of thing. Hope that made sense. All right, well, let's have a prayer together, and then we'll be done with our class this morning.